In this video series, we've been learning about mediators and how a mediator can mediate, or that is, explain the relationship among an explanatory variable and a response variable. Now it's time for me to accept my challenge to create a report in which I investigate the possibility of mediation. I've created a little shell for my report here in an R notebook, and I have included the question at the top. I will eliminate this question as soon as we have read it together. The crime data were collected in 2005 and appeared in the Statistical Abstract of the United States. Using these data, we find the rate of violent crime is related to the high school graduation rate. Analyze these data to determine if poverty is a mediating variable for this relationship. So the idea here is that high school graduation rate is correlated with violent crime. So does that mean that going to high school either increases or decreases violent crime? Does it have something to do with dropping out of high school? And the answer that's being proposed here is perhaps if high school is related to violent crime, it's because whether or not you graduate from high school can influence your income, and that in turn could influence whether or not you participate in violent crime. Now, specifically, we don't have income in these data, but what we do have is poverty rate. Let's take a look at the data, actually the code book for the data. And what we notice here is that this is going to be pretty gross level analysis. That is, we are not drilling down very deep. We're not even looking at cities. We're not looking at locations or towns. What we're looking at are states. This comes from the Statistical Abstract of the United States, and the data were collected from states. So I would just suggest at the outset that while this may make for a reasonable presentation of how to look for mediation and create a report, which is my intent here, I don't put a lot of stock in what we get from this because states are so heterogeneous within themselves. That is, what happens in the cities in the state is different than in the towns. And what happens in one city in a state could be very different from what happens in another city in the state. So using state level data for this, I think is only appropriate from the standpoint of a demonstration, not from the standpoint of a real research takeaway. So let's keep that in mind. So with that in mind, notice the variables that we have. We have the violent crime rate, number of violent crimes per 100,000 people. What I don't have here is a definition of violent crime. We have the percent of the population living in metropolitan areas, which in fact could influence the amount of violent crime, since we would probably expect more violent crime in metropolitan areas than in rural areas. We have a percent of the population that is white. We have a percent of the population that graduated from high school, and we have percent of population living below the poverty line. We are only going to focus on three variables in this data set. Violent crime is going to be the response variable, and percent of population that graduated from high school is going to be the explanatory variable. The question of interest that we're exploring here is poverty a mediating variable? That is, does it come in a chain between high school graduation rates and violent crime rates? Can high school graduation rates perhaps suggest poverty levels, which in turn suggest violent crime rates? That's the question that we're going to be looking at in this report. So returning to my notebook, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this question and start from scratch with loading my data here. Let's go ahead and run this and take a look at these data. So in my environment, I have called this object crime. And if I click the little blue arrow over here in the environment, we can see the variables, and we just saw the definitions of those variables. Here we have the states. And one thing I noticed, there are 51 of them. One of them is not a state, not at this time at least, and that is DC. So these are the data I'm handed, but the state is going to be the unit of analysis. DC is unlike any other state in which it is only a city. So I'm going to start by actually removing that from the data to be able to make more sense in terms of looking at the states. So I'm going to come over here and I am going to put in some code. Notice I'm using the here library, reading the data from my data folder, which is right here. And I'm reading the data from my data folder. And now I'm going to go ahead and insert some code in order to be able to remove DC, which I noticed was on line 51. So I have already created this code. Let me just copy it in here. And so what this is doing right here is it's saying, I want to remove row 51. That minus 51 says remove row 51. Now, this over here is about columns. The first part is about rows. The next part's about columns. And this says I want to concatenate columns 2, 5, and 6. Well, let's see what columns 2, 5, and 6 are. Columns 2, 5, and 6 are violent crime, high school graduation rate, and poverty. So in other words, what I'm doing here is I'm just going to eliminate all the other variables here, most especially those state names, because those state names are not numerical. And therefore, if I was going to create things like correlation scatterplot matrices or correlation tables, it's going to be easier to do in shorthand fashion if I don't have this, I think I called it numerical, but actually alphabetical. If I don't have this alphabetical data, this text data mixed in. So I'm going to keep only numerical, and in fact, I'm keeping only those variables that I'm really focusing on here. So let me run this all again, and now let's look again at crime, and we see we have now just 50 rows of data. We've taken out Washington, D.C., and we only have the 3 variables that we're interested in. I'm going to go ahead and save this so that I keep what I have so far. And now it's time for me to write a description. I've actually written a description ahead of time. Let me go ahead and copy and paste it in. So what I say is data from the 50 states in the United States that were collected in 2005 include variables that are potentially related to violent crime rates in these states. In this study, I will examine the relationship of high school graduation rate to violent crime rate, and will also research whether poverty rate might be a mediator to help explain an association among these variables. And then I provide here the source of data, and I'm going to go ahead and put an asterisk on each end in order to italicize it. And we're off and running. There's a start to what we're doing here today. So let me now start considering the analysis, and I'm going to begin with a picture. I like to begin with pictures, so let me go ahead and set up for that by doing scatterplots. So I'm going to go ahead and copy over what I have created here. So let's see what this does. This is going to give me all the pairs of variables in my data set, of which there are only 3. And I'm going to end up with only 3 scatter plots, although there will be 6 appearing because each one's going to appear twice with different variables on different axes, and then axes, there's a good word. And then I'm going to have these 3 variables: violent crime, high school graduation rate, and poverty rate. Right now I'm going to go ahead and leave this title in, but I'm going to need to remember to take it out because I want to put a nicer caption than that on this picture. The width here allows me to make my scatter plots smaller or bigger, and in this case I'm making them bigger so they fill more of the page and I can see them in a clearer format than if it was small. So looking at this, what do I see? I see that now violent crime is going to be the response. So because it's the response variable, we're going to want it on the vertical axis. So I'm going to look over in this first row here rather than looking down here where violent crime's on the horizontal axis. So here's what I said about violent crime and high school graduation rate. Notice that as the high school graduation rate increases, violent crime decreases. And that is what we would expect given our potential for poverty being a mediating variable. The more dropouts we have, the more students that don't finish high school, the higher the graduation or the higher the violent crime rate for the city. So over here, high levels of dropout would be a low level of graduation percentage. And then here I'm noticing that as poverty goes up, so does violent crime. This looks like it may be not meeting our conditions quite right for interpretation. I see a little bit of a curvilinear thing here. Actually, looking at this one, I see a little bit of a curvilinear as well. So just keep in mind that what we're going to be talking about when we write this up is putting a line through these data, which may not be the best model. Here, we're going to put a line through these data. And so rather than going up, and then leveling out, which is kind of what I see here, we're going to have a line that comes right through here. So this will be fine for our demonstration, but again, I'm pointing out if you were working on this as your actual research project, you might want to consider looking into how to create curvilinear models instead of linear models when you see these kind of data. If I look at the high school graduation rate in poverty, I see that as the graduation rate increases, poverty decreases, and that's in fact what I had imagined when I proposed this theory that poverty could be a mediator between the high school graduation and violent crime. And in this case, it looks like a linear relationship is indeed a good one. Okay, so let me go ahead and create a correlation table with this. And here it is. Notice in my code, I've rounded to 3 digits beyond the decimal point. So I'm looking at the correlation, all the correlations among these 3 variables. Here's our explanatory and response variable. They're moderately correlated, minus 0.45. Our explanatory variable and the mediator look to be correlated, 0.32. And then we have the heaviest correlation is between high school and poverty, which we think that poverty might be mediating the relationship of high school to violent crime. So let me put in some text here and clean some things up a bit. I'm going to go ahead and put in a caption for that scatter plot. I'm going to put it in italics, and I'm going to get rid of this main down here. All right, let's see if that got rid of the main. It did. And I'm going to instead use this figure 1 scatterplot matrix of 3 state variables. Let me go ahead and put in some pre-constructed text so that you don't have to sit here and watch me typing. The scatterplots in figure 1 illustrate the zero-order correlations. Remember, a zero-order correlation is just another name for a simple correlation, a correlation among 2 variables. Among the 3 variables of interest, violent crime per 100,000 people, percent of high school graduates, and percent living in poverty. A state is the unit of analysis. I'm indicating that here so that anyone reading this report knows that we're dealing with states, not cities. So all 3 of these variables are statewide rates for 2005. There are clear relationships among all 3 pairs of variables. Violent crime is negatively associated with high school graduation rates and positively associated with poverty rates. Poverty rates are negatively associated with high school graduation rates. That's everything that we saw below, and I know from past reports that I might want to leave a little extra space here, and so I'm putting in some slashes to leave some extra space. And then I need to create for my table a caption for it as well. And I forgot up here that I'm going to want to hide the code chunk but show the output. So I'm going to show output only. And down here, I'm going to show output only. Okay, up here, yes, up here I already said don't show anything, include equals false. In fact, I also want to turn off any warning. Actually, warnings I'll leave on just in case there are warnings, then I can go fix them. But I'll turn off messages because often when libraries are loaded, there's a message, so I don't want to see that. Okay, so I've turned that off. Just trying to fix things up here. I have some pre-constructed text for this correlation table. Table 1 is a correlation matrix among these same variables. Violent crime is moderately associated with high school graduation rate, not graduate rate, graduation rate. And poverty rate, high school graduation rate. I guess graduate would be okay, high school graduate rate. Graduation rate strongly correlated with poverty rate. And again, I'm going to leave a little bit of space. And let me see how it's looking so far. And I do that by knitting. And it halted. So I've got a problem. Let's see what happened. Halting from, figure width here. That disappeared. I think 10 is what I had in before. Yeah, that looks good. Let's try it again. There we go. Okay, so the top of it all looks good. The first paragraph is separated from the figure because I put an extra space. Table 1 separated from the correlation matrix. So far, so good. I think at this point, I'm going to stop this video and then resume creating this report in the next video.